If you are seeking treatment for a pelvic floor issue, breathing should always be part of your assessment. Here's why. So first, let's talk about pelvic floor location and function. In the pelvis, the pelvic floor musculature is located here in what's called the pelvic outlet. It has an extremely important role in helping hold up our internal organs and to help regulate the internal pressure inside our body, especially with movement and physical activity. If this musculature isn't working optimally, it can lead to potential issues, especially those most often associated with pelvic floor problems, such as incontinence or prolapse. What's the link to breathing? Along with the diaphragm, the pelvic floor is the other main player in breathing mechanics. Both the diaphragm and the pelvic floor change position and shape with every single breath that we take, working in synchrony to change the pressure and volume inside our trunk, which allows the flow of air in and out as we breathe. After an exhale, the diaphragm and pelvic floor start in these positions. The diaphragm at the top in a dome position and the pelvic floor at the bottom in kind of a flattened position. When we inhale, the diaphragm will push down and flatten out at the same time as the pelvic floor also moves down and stretches, kind of like a hammock. As we exhale back out, the pelvic floor will push back up into a flattened position as the diaphragm domes back up again. When the pelvic floor comes down into this hammock position, what it's doing is stretching or elongating in order to accept the downward force of the internal organs, which are getting squished down onto it. When it pushes back up on the exhale, it has to push all the internal organs back up again. This means that for optimal pelvic floor health, we need to have the ability to both stretch and yield and accept downward force, as well as contract and push and generate upward force against gravity. The expansion and compression of the pelvic floor muscles, as well as the pressure that's changing inside our body, creates specific changes in the shape of our pelvis. When the pelvic floor is in the ascended or more flattened position or contracted position, it pushes the bottom of the pelvis apart like this, which creates an overall narrowing in the rest of the pelvis. When the pelvic floor goes into its descended or elongated or stretched position, the bottom of the pelvis comes closer together like this, which creates an overall wider shape in the rest of the pelvis. Both the wide and the narrow shape of the pelvis are required for optimal pelvic floor function, as well as having full mobility available to us in the hips. For example, the narrower position of the pelvis here is what gives us internal rotation, adduction, and extension of our hips, since it positions the hip socket to face more forward. The wider position of the pelvis here is what gives us our external rotation, abduction, and flexion of our hips, since it positions the hip socket to face more backward. If I have restrictions in either the elongation phase or the contraction phase of the pelvic floor, then it also follows that I'm going to have trouble creating the corresponding shape in the pelvis. For instance, let's say that my pelvic floor is much more biased toward the descended or inhalation state. This means that my pelvis is much more prone to be in the wider shape and may not be able to change shape into the narrower model, so to move from here to there. For any movement in my body where I need to be able to create a narrower pelvis shape, for instance in a hip hinge or deadlift motion, I'm going to struggle to do that and will likely compensate to get there. And then vice versa, if I'm more biased toward the ascended or exhalation state of the pelvic floor, I'm much more likely to be in this narrow pelvis shape. For any movement where I would need to produce a wider pelvis shape, such as in a squat, I'm going to struggle to get into that necessary position. The ability of the pelvic floor to oscillate back and forth between inhalation and exhalation positions is key to being able to access compensatory free movement, as well as resolving common pelvic floor problems. This is why any assessment of the pelvic floor should take breathing into account. While it's not necessarily the entire picture and other factors may also be at play, no pelvic floor treatment program is complete without this foundational element.